I am James John Davies, but you know I prefer John. I was born on December 28, 1943 in Mount Kisco, New York, a little town near Katona, New York, where my father was the minister of the United Methodist Church. My father was Dr. D. George Davies, who was a fairly prominent minister in the New York Conference. And as such, as my life progressed, we moved several times. We moved from Katona to Middletown, New York, then to Kingston, New York, and then to my home in Poughkeepsie, New York. Poughkeepsie is where I consider my home to be. Now at the time, these little communities had one thing in common. It was called IBM. IBM was a growing corporation at that time, and I had no idea what part that would play in my future in the years to come. My father was Dr. David George Davies, and my mother was Nema Daisy Wessner, both from Sioux City, Iowa. They met at Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa, on the tennis courts one morning. My mother was going to marry a doctor. Well, she married a clergyman instead. That was in 1936. My father was a no-nonsense kind of a guy, no nonsense at all. And my mother was fairly stern as well. They took their life very seriously, and he took the profession that he was in very seriously, and my mother supported him all of his life. He graduated from Morningside College, Union Theological Seminary, and decided that to get out of the shadow of his grandfather, he would go to the New York Conference of the Methodist Church. So after they got married in 1939, they moved to Stamford, New York, where he began his pastoral ministry in the New York State Conference. He was sent to progressively larger churches in the New York Conference of the Methodist Church, and those are in the towns that I told you earlier, until he reached a point where, after he was district superintendent at Kingston, New York, he had a very large promotion to one of the big churches in New York City. Had he taken that, he very likely would have gone on to become a bishop. But because he chose to raise his family not in New York City, he decided to go to Poughkeepsie, New York, which was a very large church serving the largest IBM facility on record at the time. And so he had an incredible 11-year pastorate at Poughkeepsie, which is where I went through high school and which became my home. My mother also graduated from Morningside College, where she was a homecoming queen. She graduated with honors. She could have gone on to do anything in her life that she wanted to. She was a poet, an author. She could write songs. She was just an incredible person. But she suborned her life to my father to be a minister's wife. Part of me has always regretted that, because I think it never unlocked her true full potential. My parents were exceptionally close to each other. And I say exceptionally because they were joined at the hip. They were locked together. Everything that they did as a real team. They had a wonderful, incredibly forgiving, close relationship. Some of that was good, and some of it wasn't so good. I'll get to the not so good in a few minutes. But one of the things that my family did was that they made a point to take me to Wales when I was just a young man, and introduced me to my British relatives. And in Wales they would say Welsh relatives, because they were very independent-minded in the north of Wales. We didn't much talk about the Brits, and the Brits didn't talk about them. So it all worked out. It was a very interesting time. One of the high points of my parents' lives, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but one of the high points of my parents' lives at the time was that he was named, actually they were named together, as joint U.S. delegates to a peace conference in Moscow, Russia in 1970, almost at the height of the nuclear tensions between the U.S. and Moscow. That would turn out to be the trip of a lifetime for both of them. My sister Mary and I were raised in a very strict household, as most preachers' children were at the time. Everything was strict. There was no drinking. We were expected to be role models for the community, and that put a lot of pressure on us. I'm sure most of it was unintended, but the pressure was there, and it turned out it was the same for almost everyone who was a preacher's kid at the time. They called us PKs. My mom and my dad were married for 48 years. And finally, one day while he was packing to go to Red China with my uncle, he had a stroke and died the next morning. My mother, unfortunately, and this goes back to them being too close and too loving, lived another 7 years. But those were not happy years for her. She was depressed, she was morose, and here's the beautiful woman that could write and be a poet and be such a charming person, trapped in a depressive state that almost broke our hearts. So finally in 1994 she passed away, and they're both buried together in Sioux City, Iowa, which was their home to begin with in the family plot.